Life, at its core, is a mosaic of experiences, some bright and some shadowy, shaping who we become with every step. For me, my personal landscape was dramatically altered by the relentless arrival of panic syndrome. It's not a momentary weakness or a passing nervousness. It's an overwhelming internal storm, capable of paralyzing and dismantling normalcy with terrifying ferocity. Before it was a diagnosis, it was a visceral sense of impending doom, a faceless dread that nestled in the chest, tightening the throat and stealing the breath. The initial manifestations were subtle, almost imperceptible, attributed to excessive stress, sleepless nights, or simply a more challenging phase. However, the frequency and intensity of these episodes escalated, transforming the familiar into a minefield of anxiety. The problem crystallized when panic went from being an occasional visitor to a permanent resident, dictating rules and brutally limiting my world. Daily tasks, once automatic and effortless, became insurmountable mountains. Leaving the house became an act of extreme courage, as any stimulus, an unexpected noise, a crowd, the mere anticipation of an appointment, could trigger a chain reaction that culminated in a panic attack. It was as if my body, betraying my mind, went into a state of high alert for no apparent reason. My heart raced like an uncontrolled drum, my breath rasped, my hands shook uncontrollably, and a terrible feeling of loss of control, of imminent death, took over everything. The outside world took on distorted, threatening contours, while my inner universe was reduced to a silent cry for help. What makes this narrative unique is not only the battle with panic syndrome itself, but the way this often misunderstood and stigmatized condition has nearly undermined every pillar of my existence. The difficulty lies in explaining to a world largely operating under the logic of rationality that a panic attack is a genuine and devastating experience, not a fabrication or a quest for attention. Attempts to share what was happening often met with a wall of misunderstanding, minimization, and simplistic advice that, while well-intentioned, only intensified the feeling of isolation and inadequacy. It's believed that suffering must have a visible, palpable cause, something that can be pinpointed and clinically diagnosed. But what to do when the illness resides in the recesses of the mind and body, manifesting externally in physical symptoms that belie the absence of real danger? This dichotomy between the internal perception of catastrophe and the external reality of safety is one of the cruelest facets of panic syndrome, creating a chasm between the individual and those around them. Social isolation became an inevitable consequence. Shame and fear of judgment led me to avoid situations that could trigger an attack, which in turn alienated me from friends, family, and activities that once gave my life meaning. Work, social relationships, hobbies, everything began to crumble under the weight of constant anxiety and unpredictable attacks. The internal struggle was exhausting, waged in silence most of the time, as verbalizing the depth of my despair felt like a confession of weakness in a world that values resilience at all costs. There was a constant feeling of being shipwrecked in a stormy sea, with dry land ever more distant, and the hope of rescue seemed ever more elusive. The question that loomed large was, how do I find a way back to life when existence itself became synonymous with fear and seclusion? This is the journey I propose to share, a raw and honest account of how panic disorder nearly consumed me completely. Therapy initially seemed like a complex maze, a minefield of approaches, and the tenuous hope of finding a safe path. The journey to recovery was not linear, but rather a serpentine path of trial and error, with moments of despair interspersed with glimpses of improvement. The first step, and perhaps the most intimidating, was admitting the need for outside help. My initial resistance to seeking a mental health professional reflected that deep-seated fear of being labeled, of being seen as crazy or weak. However, the severity of my symptoms and the devastating impact on my life made inaction untenable. It was an act of courage, more than resignation, to sit in that chair for the first time, ready to bare my soul to a stranger. Trust slowly built through. Regular sessions became the foundation for unraveling the deepest roots of my anxiety. The core of psychotherapeutic treatment for me lay in learning specific techniques for managing crises. Cognitive restructuring, for example, became a powerful tool against the catastrophic thoughts that dominated my attacks. It wasn't about denying reality, but about challenging the validity of the distorted interpretations my anxious brain constructed. For example, instead of succumbing to the certainty of a heart attack when my chest tightened, I learned to ask myself, this sensation is unpleasant, but is it really dangerous? What concrete evidence supports the idea that something catastrophic is happening right now? This practice, initially arduous, gradually reprogrammed my automatic fear responses. Another key aspect was gradual exposure to what I feared. If fear of crowds paralyzed me, the therapist guided me to face controlled social situations, starting with brief interactions in sparsely populated places and progressively progressing to more challenging environments. This systematic desensitization, while frightening in its conception, has proven surprisingly effective in reducing the intensity of panic reactions. Furthermore, the realization that panic disorder was not a character flaw, but a neurobiological condition was liberating. Understanding the brain chemistry, physiological triggers, and dysfunctional thought patterns that fueled the attacks removed the guilt and shame that oppressed me. This scientific perspective, combined with the empathic support of professionalism, allowed me to approach the condition with the objectivity necessary for combating it. I discovered that anxiety is, in itself, a survival mechanism, and that in disorders like panic, this alarm system becomes hypersensitive, triggering at inappropriate times. Consequently, the focus of treatment became readjusting this system, not eliminating it completely. This distinction is crucial. The goal was not to live without anxiety, which is impossible and undesirable, but rather to prevent anxiety from controlling my life. On the other hand, pharmacotherapy proved to be an important complement to this approach. Medication, carefully prescribed, acted as a stabilizer, alleviating the most acute symptoms and allowing psychological therapies to have a greater effect. It wasn't a magic cure, but a pharmacological aid to make the recovery process more manageable. It was through this synergistic combination of psychological support and, where necessary, medication that I began to glimpse the possibility of not only surviving but thriving again. The journey to rediscover my own strength amid the fragility of crises was a testament to human resilience and the vital importance of seeking appropriate knowledge and support. By interweaving these experiences, one perceives a common thread that, while sometimes invisible amidst the turbulence, has always been present: the intrinsic quest to restore control and one's own identity. It's as if, after traveling a winding path full of shadows, the horizon began to clear, not by magic, but by acquiring a new perspective and refined tools. Resilience, once an abstract concept, manifested itself in the ability, even after each setback, to find a latent strength to move forward, readjusting the route and learning from each obstacle. The journey, therefore, did not culminate in the total eradication of adversity. That would be an unrealistic simplification, but rather in the transformation of the relationship with it, transforming paralyzing fear into a manageable alert. Reflecting on this journey thus far, the complexity inherent in overcoming challenges that reside in both the mind and the body becomes even more evident. Each step toward understanding and self-management was paved with the need to dismantle ingrained beliefs and rebuild, piece by piece, the the perception of security and capacity. The transition from a state of fragility to one of relative plenitude was not a single event, but a confluence of conscious efforts and the acceptance of the need for continuous adaptation. Conceptually, we can envision this process as sailing through a rough ocean where the ultimate goal is not to dry the sea, but to learn to navigate skillfully, utilizing one's own currents and winds to reach a safe harbor and, more importantly, to rediscover the beauty of the horizon. At this point in the story, the convergence of individual struggles and coping strategies invites us to consider the deeper meaning of self-awareness and the search for help. The collective experience of similar challenges, even if lived in solitude, points to the universality of the search for balance and well-being. What once seemed an insurmountable, isolated, and unnameable burden takes on clearer contours as the stages of learning and adaptation unfold. It is as if, by piecing together the scattered fragments of a complex experience, a cohesive tapestry emerges, revealing the intrinsic strength of the human spirit in its capacity for adaptation and overcoming. Anticipation for the final stage is built on this new understanding, an invitation to reflect on the legacy of this journey and the future that lies ahead.